So again, looks like most people are back. We're still going to have a couple joining us, but we are going to, get moving reasonably quickly this afternoon. So just that reminder that we're going to be looking at, firstly, we're going to be looking at sort of all the different ways of involving people in influencing decision-making with Parliament and government as well. I'm going to start very much with a focus on petitions. Then, as we talked about in weekend 4, we're also going to be looking at referendums, and we're also going to be looking at the sort of deliberative processes and their involvement with the representative system in the wider range of ways, as we talked about in weekend 3. So just a reminder to people, just to sort of, a few people need to still rename themselves if they can. Usually just sort of first name, how you want to be referred to. So yeah, a couple of people just sort of changing their names. Great, I can see that. And anybody who's having trouble with that, the support team in the background will be able to get to you once we've got everybody in. Okay, so before we get on to petitions, and again, we're getting to the bit of the pointy end here now. There are lots of things that discussions are getting a bit harder. People have some pretty strong views around some of the different aspects of democracy that we've been talking about, both views that things are working really well and views where, some people are thinking, actually, we're in a bit of a crisis at the moment. We've been looking through the Jamboard you were looking at this morning and the range of different words that people were pulling out as reflecting how they feel about democracy in the UK at the moment. And we're realizing that, some of the discussions, could get a bit more tense. So, because we are going to this afternoon ask you to start making what potentially will be some of the more final decisions around what the Assembly recommendations potentially will be. You'll still have the opportunity to vote individually. So it's not necessarily about you have to agree with a specific recommendation, but about thinking, is this a sensible recommendation to put to the vote of the whole membership and potentially end up as a recommendation of the Assembly. So before we get into that, I'm just going to share my screen with a little reminder of some of the conversation guidelines, and then go straight into introducing the first topic for this afternoon. So, just a reminder of the conversation guidelines. And as I was just saying, we can disagree. And it's important that we do disagree with each other, because if we all had the same views, there'd be no point having these sort of deliberations and trying to find where that common ground is. But at the same time, we can try, and I'm sure all of us, can do this, try not to be disagreeable in the way that we do that. Because as we've said, everyone has that right to speak, and everyone has that right to be listened to for their views as well. And the wider guidelines that you created there as well, about, really important to be sort of measured with how you speak your mind. We want people to speak their mind. We want people to give their views on the issues that we're discussing. And it's not about restricting anyone's opinion on the issues we're discussing around the future of democracy. But it's also about recognizing that, we're trying not to actually be offensive to others, and respecting that everyone has a right to be able to participate in these discussions in a way that, is comfortable for them. All right, it looks like we've got most people in from the waiting room now, so we will get going with the topic for today. So we're focusing on the powers of petitions to Parliament. And just that reminder that when we're talking petitions to Parliament, we're talking very specific form of petition that actually is initiated directly onto the Parliament's website. There are rules around this, and we'll come back to that. So when we're talking about petitions to Parliament, we're not so much thinking of a petition that you might, sign, the counter of the local library for something. These are formal petitions to Parliament. So there was a proposed resolution that people voted on in the ballot that we did between weekend 5 and weekend 6. And the resolution was framed in this way based on the conclusions and some of the sort of interim voting and Mentimeter voting and things that took place during weekend 4. And as you can see there, this proposed resolution that the use of petitions should be extended received in principle support from 72%. And just, yes, that reminder, as I started to say, what the current sort of powers, I suppose, or what petitions can be used for is to get things that are important to the public or campaign groups to the attention of government and parliament. And just that reminder that currently with 10,000 signatures, the petition receives a written response by government. And with 100,000 signatures, a petition will be considered for a debate in Parliament. And usually a debate will take place in some form or another. And again, the types of petitions that can go through this process, there are limits. They have to call for a specific action from the UK government or the House of Commons. And they must be about something that the government or the House of Commons is actually responsible for. So keep that in mind as we're thinking about the petition process. So there were a number of recommendations, which you'll be able to see in the overview document that we've sent to you. Some of them were pretty clear, and there was a lot of consensus from people that they were clear and something that should go forward as something that the Assembly as a whole should vote on. So this one here about encouraging more participation, there needs to be much wider public awareness of the petitions process so that actually it's being used most effectively. And there was a second one here about that any parliamentary debate initiated through the petitions process should be meaningful. And that was something that a lot of people were concerned about, that things just sort of being debated or talked out, but actually not necessarily being engaged with more widely by Parliament and by MPs. And so one of the suggestions, and it's there, is one way of achieving this, whether it's practical or not, but one way of achieving this might be to require that minimum number of MPs to attend. But there were a number of other sort of potential recommendations there that were sort of prioritised that extended what a petition should be able to demand from Parliament quite a way. So there was a question about whether it should be able to demand a public inquiry or a referendum, or that a citizens' assembly is convened, or, and this is the other alternative, and we were talking about it, but we haven't really got a recommendation about strengthening what is actually expected from the debate in Parliament. And before we go into groups to talk about this, I'm just going to hand over to Alan for a moment to give us a bit more context.
Great, thank you very much, Kayla. So yeah, I'm going to share my screen so that I can say a little bit more about those particular possible recommendations on additional powers that petitions to Parliament could have. So just to recap what Kayla's just said about how petitions work in the UK. So as Kayla said, anyone can start an online petition, 10,000 signatures lead to a government response, 100,000 signatures normally lead to a debate in Parliament. And there's also a committee in Parliament that can choose to hold a more detailed inquiry into an issue that there's been a petition on, if people feel that would be, if the people in the committee feel that would be helpful. I thought it might be useful just to put some numbers on that, just so that you can get a sense of how that actually works in practice. So in the last 2 years, since the 2019 election, so that's exactly 2 years ago as of tomorrow, there have been just over 7,500 petitions in total. So lots and lots of petitions appear on the petitions website. Most of these never ever reach that 10,000 signature threshold. So there have been 597 that have hit the threshold for requiring a government response. And almost all of those have got their response already. A few of them have only just hit the threshold. So it takes a little while to put the response together. And then of those, 141 have hit the threshold for getting 100,000 signatures. And as Kayla said, almost always Parliament does hold a debate. So there have been 127 of these have already been debated, or again, they're just awaiting the debate in the next few weeks. So occasionally Parliament decides not to hold a debate. That's normally because Parliament has already debated the same issue very recently, and so it would just be repeating. But normally they hold a debate. And then, as I said, a petition committee can also hold inquiries, but that doesn't happen very often. But if it feels, particularly if it feels that the government's response wasn't really sufficient and it needs a bit more investigation, then it might hold an inquiry. And just to give you the feel of what that looks like, so here's the most recent petition to have got a government response, which was on making the day of Diwali a public holiday, and it got 16,000 signatures, so it needed to get a government response. And you can see there the response from the government. And basically it says that the government respects the Indian diaspora and the importance of Diwali, but it's not going to introduce an extra public holiday. And basically it says it gets lots and lots of requests for public holidays. Each public holiday costs the economy quite a lot, so it can't possibly accept all of them. And that's fairly typical in terms of length for a government response to a petition. Just very quickly, very similar systems exist in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament, but there's no similar system in the Northern Ireland Assembly. So, as Kayla said, we had three statements that you voted on in the ballot last week on potentially strengthening this petition process. So one was an idea that a petition could require a public inquiry. Another was that a petition could require a referendum. And then a third was that a petition can require a citizens' assembly. And then, as Kayla said, another idea which wasn't in any of the propositions, any of the statements, but is worth just considering, is another option could be to instead strengthen the process that the petition leads to within Parliament. So one simple change would be to require Parliament actually to have a vote at the end of a debate when it debates an issue. And taking that a little bit further, you could say that that vote needs to be an actual binding vote that Parliament and government have to accept the result of. So I'll just say a few words on potential advantages and disadvantages of each of these, just to get your thinking going on these ideas. So the first one was the idea that we could have petitions that lead directly to public inquiries. So arguments in favor of that could be that, while a public inquiry can give a really deep and expert investigation into a difficult issue, and often public inquiries are best used for situations where something's gone really badly wrong. So inquiries that are running at the moment, there's one on the Grenfell Tower fire, that disaster, and there's one going on the Manchester Arena bombing, trying to understand what went wrong with the security system that allowed that to take place. On the other hand, there could also be some arguments against allowing petitions to lead to public inquiries. So one is that public inquiries are very slow. On average, they take 2 years, but occasionally they take quite a lot longer than that, and they're very expensive to run as well. And also, if there were too many of them, then they could kind of lose their bite. So it's about 3 or 4 public inquiries are set up on average every year. And because they're big things and serious things, they get quite a lot of attention on the issue. If they were to happen a lot, then they might kind of lose that focus and that attention. And that raises an issue of, well, how many signatures would you need if you did have a system allowing petitions to lead directly to public inquiries? How many signatures would be required in order to have that effect? And that's an issue that comes up across all of these ideas about petitions. So an alternative idea might be to say that if a petition calls for a public inquiry and it gets enough signatures, then Parliament should vote on that, and that vote in Parliament should be binding. So you might want to think about that. It's an idea you might agree with or you might disagree with. Moving on to petitions for referendums. So in favor of this, one view is that we might want voters to be able to force changes that politicians oppose. Sometimes we might be concerned that politicians' interests are different from the interests of the public at large. So the public should be able to push things through. And some democracies indeed do have such systems, and at least some of them, they work quite well. So Switzerland perhaps is the system with the most experience of doing this kind of thing, and they have referendums several times a year on different issues. On the other hand, against this, the one concern is there an opportunity for really careful scrutiny of a proposal? So if you get an idea that some people put together for a petition and that gets lots of signatures and it goes direct to a referendum, what if the idea is not very well worded, or if they're offering one possible solution to a problem, but actually maybe a slightly different solution would be better? There's no opportunity there actually to properly scrutinize and think it through. And also during the campaign period, you'd be entirely reliant on the media giving a kind of clear and balanced view of the different arguments. So there may be some concerns there. And again, that question of how many signatures would be needed in order to trigger this, and in particular, how many to stop us from having just loads and loads of referendums on all sorts of quite minor issues. So, you know, if you say you allow 10% of the electorate to lead to sign a petition, and that leads to a referendum, then that would be kind of 4 or 5 million people would need to sign the petition. But there could be most other people might oppose the issue. So we might find we're having to vote on things in referendums that most people just don't agree with. So again, you might think, would an alternative be that there should be a vote in Parliament if there are enough signatures for holding a referendum? Or indeed, should the idea go to a citizens' assembly and it can recommend whether to hold a referendum, which is indeed the third idea, the third of the statements that you had. So petitions for leading to citizens' assemblies. So in favor of this, we could say that, well, this ensures that there is serious consideration that's given to potentially important issues, unlike perhaps we might think in the case of a petition leading to a referendum. And again, there are some places that are at least experimenting with this. So citizens' assemblies are still a fairly new idea, but the idea that people can petition for a citizens' assembly has been developing. There's one part of Austria that I'm aware of that has done this, and perhaps there are a few other places as well. On the other hand, we might be concerned again, citizens' assemblies are fairly slow, fairly expensive, certainly nearly not as slow and expensive as the average public inquiry, but nevertheless, you probably don't want to have these on huge numbers of things, which again raises that question about the signature threshold. And another question is, would politicians listen to a citizens' assembly that's been set up by a petition? So if politicians kind of feel that they've been cut out of the process, but they're ultimately the ones who are going to be making the final decision, is that really going to work, or are they just going to kind of dismiss whatever the citizens' assembly has come up with? So that's worth thinking about as well, which leads again to the thought that might it be a good idea for Parliament in some way to have a role? So those were the three statements that you had, but as I've been hinting on all of them, another idea might be that getting Parliament involved in some way could be a good idea, and strengthening the role of strengthening what petitions can require Parliament to do might be another way of going about this. So here are arguments for saying that a petition can require a vote, perhaps a binding vote in Parliament. So compared with the previous idea of having citizens' assemblies petitions leading to citizens' assemblies, here we might think leading rather to a vote in Parliament is good, because it means that the people who are involved in the final decisions are directly involved in the process. So the MPs, the people in Parliament who make the final decisions, are being involved. Compared to the current system where there isn't a vote, then having a vote might at least require the government to take the proposal seriously, especially if that vote was binding. On the other hand, it may be that allowing Parliament this role means that government is still able to block popular measures, persuade MPs to block popular measures. So giving Parliament this role is quite different from saying that citizens should be able to directly influence things through referendums or citizens' assemblies. And then comparing allowing a petition to lead to a vote with the current system where there's no vote, where we might be concerned that binding votes could push government into expensive commitments that they can't afford. So lots of different arguments for you to consider there. I hope that's just stimulated some thought from you. And now back to Kayla.
Okay, so as you'll see from the document that was sent to you, and when you go into your breakout rooms, we're really asking you to think about, there are all these different ideas about strengthening the role for petitions. to have a bit more reflection now on which, if any of these, actually feel like they would be a good thing that you're comfortable with putting forward to the recommendation, to be potentially a recommendation of this citizens assembly. And it's up to you. If you decide actually, yeah, we still really want to put for all of them up for the vote, then that's what you'll get to do. But if you decide that some of them maybe, you know, don't seem as good an idea as they might have before we thought about some of the other consequences, or don't seem as good an idea because actually we've agreed something else, or we're thinking something else will actually achieve that same outcome, then you can choose that it won't go through and the majority will decide. Just to say, we've had to mix up a couple of the groups a bit this afternoon, just with a couple of people joining us, a couple of people who aren't able to make it this afternoon who were here. And we just wanted to balance them up so that they're a bit more even as well. So yeah, if you do find yourself in a new group, hopefully they'll make you very welcome. And I'm sorry if you'll miss your old group, but you'll have a great time this afternoon. And we'll leave you in those groups all afternoon. Okay, over to the breakout rooms. Now, look, I'm aware that was quite a short time to sort of do these discussions. We're really making decisions now about what are the things we should be voting on later, where people will get to have all of their sort of their own personal opinions there as well and be able to share them. But this afternoon really is going to be a bit of a number of quite short, sharp discussions that are sort of helping shape what really are we going to, as an assembly, vote on in the end. So the next one that we're moving on to look at is referendums. So one of the other things that we discussed as in weekend 4 as a way of people having more influence or being able to sort of make decisions. So we're talking about the role of referendums. Okay. So in the survey, or in the ballot between weekends 5 and 6, there was the proposed resolution that was agreed that, you know, referendums are an important tool for direct democracy, and it's good to be out handing decisions back to the people at times. And again, that was agreed in principle support by 79% of the voting members. And there was some clear, you know, recommendations that people were broadly agreeing made sense and seemed to be quite sort of specific enough that, you know, we can take these forward to a vote. One about sort of improving the quality of information available to people, and the referendums should potentially be used sparingly, so not all the time, and predominantly for constitutional issues of significant national or regional importance. But there were 2 other potential recommendations that are a little less clear about what people are trying to get out of them. The first one, therefore, C, was focused around, you know, we should only be using referendums when there are really clearly defined choices. So that actually the consequences are likely to be able to be known in advance. So there have been referendums, for example, on things like electoral reform and things like that, where it is a quite simple decision of changing the system or introducing a new law that has a clearly defined outcome. And then the choice is put to people. And the second one, 4D there, is this question about that referendums should only be used to decide moral and ethical issues if there's been a long process of public education and deliberation that engages the whole public. So that, and the reason this was being sort of limited, and this seems to have been coming out of your discussions, was that there were some concerns about using a referendum on some moral or ethical issues that actually, for people that are not directly affected by the issue, actually, whether they're making informed choices or making choices that may have negative impacts on people that are going to be more directly impacted by some of those moral or ethical issues. So we're going to put you back into the breakout rooms now, just to start exploring those 2 potential recommendations, to start seeing, is there a way that you want to make them clearer, so that people who haven't been involved in your discussions, if they read them, really understand what you might be trying to think about. So over to you, and then you're going, once you've had that discussion, you'll have a break, and we'll see you back in this room after the break. Okay, so that's all the breakout rooms closed. I can see lots of people back from their break. So hopefully you've had a chance to sort of refresh yourself, or at least have a bit of a stretch or a move around before we go into the next discussion there around the next aspect of referendums that we're going to be looking at. So I can see, yeah, if people can, when they make it way back from break, to flick their cameras on if they can, just lets me know that you're all here.
What time is break, please?
Sorry?
What time is
Sorry, we've
break?
just gone right through our break, Kayla.
Oh!
My fault.
Right, well, when you go back in, you might need to give people a minute.
Will do. Will do. Thanks.
Okay, so hopefully most groups have managed to have a break, and if people haven't, hopefully facilitators will give you a sort of few moments to sort of nip away, get a drink, have a stretch, whatever we need to do. Okay, so it does look like a lot of people are back. Yeah. Okay, still maybe waiting for a few that might have gone to break later, but hopefully we'll be able to catch them up. So I'm going to share my screen again just to remind you of what we were talking about and some of the resolutions around referendums and one of the questions that we're going to ask in a moment. So let me, for some reason it's not behaving itself today for me. Let me try screen share. Okay, so this is what you were just looking at in the last conversation. So when referendums should be used for what types of discussions. But now, in the context, remember that overall, from the discussions we had in weekend 3, there were a sense that referendums are an important tool for direct democracy, and can add to a good democracy in the UK by handing important decisions back to the people. But at the same time, as I can see from lots of the, the notes and the discussions that went on, there were a lot of concerns, and particularly, draw examples from some of the recent referendums that have been very close, and a lot of people felt sort of quite unsatisfied. So there were 2 proposed sort of recommendations that were put forward by groups after weekend 3 that were a bit more contentious. And also when we did the poll between weekend 5 and weekend 6, split people's views quite a lot around, whether we look at this idea of there should be a supermajority, or whether voter turnout should depend on whether the results count. So before we go in and sort of explore this a bit further and decide whether either of these are recommendations that you think the Assembly should be continuing to consider and put to a vote, I'm going to ask Alan just to give us a little more sort of context and what might be some of the risks, benefits, or challenges around either of these recommendations.
Thank you very much, Kayla. So I'm going to share my screen as well. So what we're talking about in both of these recommendations are what we know as the referendum threshold. So the referendum threshold is basically the minimum number of votes, if you like, that you need to get in order for a proposal that's put to a referendum to pass. And basically, we've got on the table here 3 different types of referendum threshold. So the first type is what we have at the moment, and is a simple majority threshold. So that just means that whichever option in the referendum gets more votes wins. So you've got 2 proposals, 2 options that you're choosing between in a referendum, and whichever one gets more votes than the other one, that one wins. Nice and simple. The first of the 2 statements that draft statements that Kayla just put up however, offers a different kind of threshold that we tend to refer to as a supermajority threshold. So this says that just getting 50% and a tiny bit more isn't enough. You need to get above, say, 60% of the votes or 55% of the votes. So you could have different levels for that supermajority threshold, but the idea is that you need something more than just a very simple basic majority in order for an idea to go through. And then the third kind of threshold is that you could say that in addition to one of those first kinds of thresholds, you also need to get a certain proportion of people, of those people who are eligible to vote, actually turning out and voting on the day. So I think the statement actually has a 70% turnout threshold being proposed. Actually, a bit more common than that in countries around the world that do this is to say you need a 50% turnout for the result to be valid. So that means that in addition to having to get more than half of the votes or more than 60% of the votes that are actually cast, you also need at least 50% or whatever the level is of people turning out to vote in the referendum. So let's just think a little bit about arguments for these different approaches. So firstly, the choice between a simple majority threshold and a supermajority threshold. So the argument in favor of having a simple majority threshold is a really simple argument. If you have that threshold, then the option that wins more votes wins. And in a democracy, it kind of seems obvious that if you're choosing between two options and you're deciding on the basis of which is more popular, then you go with the one that is more popular between those two options. So the argument for a simple majority threshold is really, really straightforward. But quite a lot of people do often argue that we should have a supermajority threshold. One of the arguments you sometimes hear for that is that making a decision by really narrow margin can be divisive. So if you had a vote and you had 51% on one side, 49% on the other side, that's a really narrow margin by which to decide the issue, and people on the losing side could feel quite aggrieved that it was really tight and maybe they could have won. So that's an argument that's sometimes offered for having a higher threshold. Now, whether that's an argument that really works, whether it's a good argument, is something that I think it's worth thinking about. I mean, if you have, say, a 60% threshold, then it's still perfectly possible, of course, that the votes can be 51% for one side and 49% for the other side. And you're still making a decision between these. It's just that you're saying the decision is going to go in favor of the people, the 49% rather than the 51%. And is that not going to be pretty divisive? The people in the 51% might feel, well, why didn't we win the referendum? So it's not actually clear that having a higher threshold will mean that we don't get very divisive outcomes. So I'm going to fade that one out. I mean, you might think differently, but I'm not sure that that's a really good argument. Another argument that you sometimes hear is that minorities need protection from the majority. We shouldn't just have majority rule in a democracy, and that's certainly a principle that is very widely accepted, and you've accepted it in thinking, for example, about the role of the courts in protecting rights in the system. The trouble is, a lot of the minorities that need protection are 10% of the population, or 5%, or 1% of the population, and no one's going to suggest that we have a referendum threshold of 90% or 95 or 99% of people need to vote for something for it to go through. So again, it's not really clear that having a threshold of, say, 55 or 60% is actually going to protect minorities that do need protection. Then a third argument is that change can be difficult. So in a referendum, basically we're always, one of the options is the current system, the status quo, and the other option is some kind of change from the status quo. And changing things can be tough. There can be some people who lose out. Just the process of going to a new system can be quite complex and difficult. So there's an argument that change can be difficult, and we therefore should be sure that it's what we want before we go ahead. And I think that's probably a stronger argument. It is indeed the case that often a referendum would lead to quite a difficult process if it goes through. And therefore we should be sure. I guess again here there's a question, well, is a threshold of 60% the best way of guaranteeing that we're really sure? Or should we prefer rather to make sure that there's lots of deliberation and thought that goes in before the actual referendum? So deliberation and thought happening in Parliament, maybe in citizens' assemblies, maybe other kinds of processes. So it's worth just thinking about the role of thresholds compared to some of the other things in the propositions in the statements that you've got before you. And then in terms of turnout thresholds, comparing the argument for not having a turnout threshold and just having the simple majority threshold on its own versus arguments for having a turnout threshold, then again, the argument for the simple approach is that simple argument that if an option wins more votes than the other one, you might say in a democracy, surely it should win. The argument for having a turnout threshold, however, is that turnout sometimes is quite low in referendums. And we have referendums with a third of people only turning out, sometimes even fewer than that. So that could mean that a minority can force their will on the majority of people who, for whatever reason, have chosen not to vote in that referendum. And that we should stop that by having a higher threshold. On the other hand, someone arguing for just a simple approach could say, well, yeah, but if you have a turnout threshold, then in effect, not voting in the referendum can count as though you're voting no, you're voting against the proposal. So say you look, for example, at the referendum in London in 1998 on whether they should create the London Mayor and the London Assembly. Then the majority in favour of creating the London Mayor among those who voted was really high. It was about 2/3, I think. But only about a third of people actually turned out to vote. So had you had a turnout threshold, say of 50%, then that proposal wouldn't have gone through, but it wouldn't have gone through not because there was lots of opposition to it really, but just because there were quite a lot of people who didn't really care, who weren't particularly bothered, who didn't really have a strong view. And is it right that those people who don't really have a strong view should in effect be counted as voting no? And just linked to that again, is a concern that sometimes if you have a turnout threshold, then that can encourage people to boycott the vote. It can encourage some campaigners to campaign for people not to vote, because that's the best way of stopping a change. So if you oppose a change and you know that actually most people support the change, then sometimes you can prevent that change by just getting the turnout low enough that although people have voted for it by a majority, it doesn't go through. The threshold is the turnout threshold has not been met. So there are various arguments on both sides of this. You might think it's good to ensure that a referendum doesn't go through with low turnout. On the other hand, you might think maybe it's better to ensure that we don't have a referendum on an issue that doesn't really excite people, and we only have referendums on issues that do have reasonably high turnout. So that's all that I will say on that.
Okay, so some food for thought there about, whether these are the types of recommendations that the Assembly should be putting forward, whether it is something that we do want to put to a vote, or whether actually, as I said earlier, that, it may be, there's things that feel like they're naturally a good idea, and then you have to balance up what would the implications of that be. And maybe the agreement is, yeah, we still want to put this forward, or choice might be, we might leave that one for now. Everything, even things that we choose not to take forward to a vote, will still be part of the overall report about what the Assembly considered and some of the arguments for and against it that you've made, but wouldn't necessarily, if it doesn't go to the vote, be part of the formal recommendations. Just so you know, that's the situation. So we're going to open up the breakout rooms, and again, you'll have about 25 minutes. And if you haven't had a break, try and at least have a little 5-minute break if you didn't manage it before. Okay, that looks like everyone is now back with us. Hope that's everyone back with us. Great. Thank you very much for sticking with us. I know there are lots of sort of quite quick conversations starting to try and make some sort of decisions leading us towards the types of things that as an Assembly as a whole we're going to vote on. And just to take the last bit of the discussion we're going to be having today, focusing in on the other things that we spoke about in terms of how people can be more involved. So again, I'm just going to share a little bit, come back from the ballot that happened between the meetings. So other ways of the public being involved. And here we go. So there was a proposed resolution put to you. that, believe that the UK public as a whole has to become more engaged with the democratic system, but also a caution that you don't think it'll happen unless people have more confidence they can make a difference. And in principle, that was supported by the 86% of the voting members. And a second resolution about actually, for a good UK democracy, then voters also need to become more engaged and take that responsibility. And again, that was really highly supported and fits in with the principles you were talking about informed electorate. In the document that we sent you, there was a whole series of potential recommendations there, 2C to 2H, that give really clear statements of intent, what people are thinking about to help achieve this. And we're not going to go into discussing all of them today, but they'll all be there when you come to do your final vote. Notice A and B are missing, and some of the groups will be looking at that when we go back into groups. And there was another proposed resolution around the use of deliberative processes like citizens' assemblies. And a sense from members that, again, there was a value in using these more throughout to understand views of the public. And two of the recommendations around that are really quite clear. I'm not saying you have to agree with them or disagree with them, but actually they clearly state what they're talking about. That actually, if they're going to happen, they need to have an impact, and that deliberative processes should be used that are effective on these really kind of divisive issues that are important to people. But there were a number of other recommendations that came up around the deliberative things that, while the intent is clear, there's some questions about, do they need some little rewording? Do they need a little more focus? So that's the thing we're going to ask some of the other groups to look at in this last discussion. So again, it's not about whether we necessarily agree or disagree with the actual recommendation, but whether it's making itself clear the intent that was there, so that when we all come to vote and then people do read whatever we recommend, it'll be clear what it's all about. So I'm going to put you straight back into your breakout rooms just for just under 25 minutes. I'm sure it's been a long day for a lot of you. We've covered a lot today, but hopefully what it sort of draws out to you is actually how much we've covered over the last 5 weekends that we've spent together, and that, 5 weekends we spent together, and how much you've actually generated and created and come to conclusions and worked together to consider. We've got some really good quality stuff there to be taking forward. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the stuff we looked at in weekend 5. So you've got it there in the overview, really focusing in. We're not going to necessarily discuss a lot about the regulators. There's some pretty clear recommendations there. And then discussing the role of the courts particularly. And then that time towards the end to really just come to those broader statements of, how we're feeling about democracy and our aspirations for democracy in the UK. Before I let you go, I'm just going to hand you over to Alan for, he has something he wants to share with you, and then we'll let you get away.
Very, very quick word from me about an email that hopefully has just arrived in your email inboxes in the last few moments. So you might remember right at the back of the assembly, you filled in a consent form to consent to taking part in the assembly, consent to the people that involve, that's Kayla's team, to hold your contact details so that we could actually allow you to be part of the assembly. That consent to hold your personal details, that runs out not long after the end of the assembly. And we'd quite like to stay in touch with you. So we'd like to keep you informed about what happens with once the report is published, if there's kind of stuff being picked up in Parliament and so on, then we'd like to be able to let you know about that. And also we're hoping that, so at the moment, it's just the involved team who hold your contact details. We at the University College London team don't have access to those details. But we also would quite like to be able to get in touch with you and again, keep you informed about what's happening on the project, and maybe also talk with you about your experiences on the project, maybe have some of you involved in the process when we're launching the report of the Citizens Assembly itself. So we're really hoping that you'll want to stay in touch. And there's a consent form that's arrived in your email, as I said, just in the last few minutes. So if you're able to, just before you log off today, go in, get that email, check out that consent form. If you've got any questions about it, then of course we can answer those questions. But if you're happy for us to stay in touch, then it would be great if you would be able to fill in
I
that
think
form.
you might have messed the form up a little bit.
Luana, was that, did I hear? Yeah.
I think you might have messed the form up a little bit.
We
The first question on it says, how much would you agree or disagree? But actually you can only just tick a box next to the questions. It doesn't actually have the how much you agree or disagree thing on it.
Okay, it may have gone slightly wrong in translation into the final version of the form.
I've just
sorry,
just
give me 2 seconds and I can correct that.
And we'll get it resent out. So look, I guess Alan's asking you to sort of have a look now while you're on the computer, because it would be great to be able to stay in touch with you. But if you come back on later or tomorrow morning when you log on and you're waiting for the meeting to start, you can have a look at it then. We'll get it back out to you very quickly.
It doesn't actually, it should be fine now. It doesn't need to be resent. If anyone wanted just to even refresh their browser, the form is correct. So just work away.